And he said to me, "Are you the guy who made the Springbok go the wrong way?" And I said, "Well, you could also say that I'm the guy who helped save the Springbok."
Sure.
So suddenly, instead of a logo discussion, it became a brand discussion. And Sean created the logo of the two
birds,
the two hoopus coming together.
Yeah.
Yes. Someone said, "Well, you've got the birds coming together. It's an open book now, but there's no writing there. We should put some writing in." And we all held our heads and said, "No, that's the last thing you do.
Yeah.
You don't want to look like an Oxford or a Cambridge or a Harvard."
According to Jeremy Sampson, what is a brand?
A brand to me is something that
Pat. It's Pat on brands. Watch how you branded, man. A pat on the back is a pat from the man. Let it be branded, man. Pat from the pat is a pat on the brand. If it's enormous.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting episode of the Pat on Brands podcast with me, Pat Mahlangu. Today, we have another legend. You know, those that know me quite well, I'm always interested in talking to those that walk the path before us because it is through them that we can learn, a lot about particularly this industry, And today I have the legend himself, dubbed as the brand father of South Africa. Born in the UK, but now lives in South Africa. Mr. Jeremy Sampson. Welcome.
Pat, it's my pleasure. Finally, we get to sit down together, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Yeah, and I mean, it took some time for this to happen. We were scheduled to, I think, was it 3 weeks ago or so? But obviously, you're traveling, then, anything can happen during the travels. You can catch the flu,
As I did, yes.
Yeah, and that was the case with you. But I'm glad that you could find the time to have this chat with us. And I want to kick off by congratulating you, for your lifetime achievement recognition at the MAAs. How does that achievement make you feel?
Well, you were there at the evening, Pat, and as I said, when you have a standing ovation from your peers, it is one of the most humbling experiences you can have. And, when the announcement was made and I went up on stage and everyone had been standing and slapping me on the back and, and then I was on the side of the stage and people were saying nice things about me, but I couldn't see the screen, so I couldn't see who was speaking. So it was only later. Some of the voices I recognized, but not all of them. And then, of course, saying a few words and then going back to my table. And again, everyone stood up again. And, so very, very humbling and thinking, well, why me? What have I done to do this?
Sure.
But then reminding people that, in fact, it was my second lifetime achievement. Because back in 2010, at Financial Mail, at the AdFocus, I was also a lifetime achiever. Now, I was the first then non-advertising man, because really my background is branding, marketing, and design. I qualified as a designer originally. And there, again, they called me up and made me lifetime achiever. So again, I got a standing ovation. So very special moments.
But I like what you said in terms of you don't do work for applause and for awards, but when you do receive one, it really does sort of mean something.
Well, I think when you're not looking for something, sometimes you enter competitions or you really would want something. But then when someone phones you and says, "Oh, by the way,"
your name came up, and the panel or the jury has reached a unanimous decision that you are worthy of a lifetime achievement. Then it's
Well, in the case of Marketing Achievement Awards, it was their inaugural lifetime achiever.
Sure.
But when they phoned me, I said, "Well, who's on the shortlist?"
Did they tell you?
And they said, "Well, it's just you, Jeremy."
Wow.
So that was very special.
Wow, amazing. But let's take it then back. You're born in the UK?
Correct.
And you schooled there?
Yep. Yeah, I was born in the West Country of England and went to a good school and did a bit of sport, but academically I wasn't that good.
Interesting. What sport did you play?
Well, I ran. And,
you ran?
Yes, I was a runner. And
wow. You just did my first comrade.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I was a speed merchant in the sense that, I won county championships and went to all England schools, and twice I made the final of the mile.
Yeah.
So that's the top 9 in the country. But that's programming you for later on, because then I went off to art school. I went to Canterbury in England, and I got my degree there.
Sure.
And again, that was a very nice part of the world to be in Kent. And you would have enjoyed it if you were running comrades, because on a Sunday we'd go out and run 10, 15 miles, but you go to the Cliffs of Dover or the Forestry Commission and that sort of thing. And then from graduating, going up to London and working for the Observer newspaper, but as a designer on their colour magazine, because in those days, colour magazines were a very big deal in the UK, and working there for a couple of years, which was very interesting because now you're being programmed, as it were, to understand deadlines. And as we were told, or as I was told in my induction, if you miss your deadline, you might as well walk out the door because you become irrelevant. And I think this is something that's stuck in my head ever since. Deadlines.
That's why even today you're on time.
I do my best.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. Was design or graphic design a thing then?
Graphic design, visual communications, yes. So, and of course, from designing magazines to brochures, and then to annual reports, that sort of thing, and then working alongside that, logos as they were in those days, symbols. And then that evolved into corporate identity, and doing quite a lot of photography and working with photographs. So that was the area that I started out in.
Sure. And back then, did you sort of imagine the world that we find ourselves in now with AI being able to design stuff?
When you think back to those days, it was almost barbaric in a sense. It was, obviously no computers at all, and a very, very different world. And I think that's one of the secrets of being a lifetime person is you've got to keep morphing, you've got to keep relevant, you've got to keep moving as well as you can. Because as you say today with AI, etc., and like a lot of people, I think AI really is still at its infancy. We hardly know where it's going to take us. So, I had my first computer on my desk in 1985, which was an Apple, and it was like a box, and that was a result of being at a conference in Washington in the States and seeing an expo of product design and seeing Apple on display, which was its very early days, and thinking this was magnificent and this was the future. So coming back to South Africa, I ordered up 2 computers, one for myself and one for my partner. And that was the start. But I always joke that it took me a couple of weeks to learn how to switch it on because
Did it come with the manual?
All these buttons and bits and pieces.
Yeah. And actually, because my next question was going to be, what brought you to South Africa?
Basically working in London, and I met a young lady from South Africa, and we were married in England. And, I'm talking the late 60s. And the economy of the UK was not good. And a lot of people, don't realize that the then minister, the Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, put a pay freeze on everyone's salary. And I think that's almost unheard of, but
I can't imagine.
No, and I'd only been working, 18 months. I just qualified, so my salary was right down there. And working on the Observer, being a newspaper, dealing with the print unions, we'd all had to join a trade union. So I was a card-carrying member of the National Union of Journalism, and we got an increase in salary because we were unionized, but it was still very low. So there came a point where, I said to my wife, well, it'd be nice to go out to South Africa and meet your family and get a better idea. And then we can come back in a couple of years type of thing. And so that was the start of things.
Wow. Then you get to South Africa. Did you have a job?
I went to...
Were there any opportunities in your field?
It was very interesting because going to South Africa House and applying, and they said it would be helpful if you had a job to go to, and then writing some letters and getting 2 offers, in fact.
Wow.
And one of them was from the largest printing group then in South Africa, in Johannesburg, the Hortus Group. But it was serendipity that they were doing a link up with an American group, which was one of the biggest design companies in the world, based in Chicago, which was Unimark International. Today in the design field, people will know of Landor from San Francisco. Well, it was like the Landor of those days. So I came out here, and within, I think, about 6 weeks, Unimark International opened its Johannesburg doors. And they had offices in, I think it was something like Milan and London and Chicago and New York, and then Johannesburg. So working with the Americans, and that taught me a lot to do with logos, but systems design, corporate identity design. And they had just done the rebranding of Ford in the States. And I remember they had 7 control manuals of all the ways you should use the logo and the colors and the typeface. So the stationery, the signage, and everything else. And that's what we started then applying in South Africa.
Wow. Interesting. Then the transition from being a graphic designer to being a consultant and being a brand man, how did that come about? Because I also understand that you launched South Africa's first ever sort of brand consultancy back in 1973.
But before that, you see, when I joined Unimark, and after a year, a lot of us got very disenchanted because the Americans ran it their way, and they got paid a lot of money, and the people here didn't get paid so well, that I was headhunted to ad agency, which became Grey Advertising, but it was in those days Phillips Bunton. And then after 9 months, they lost their main account. So I was fired. Last in, first out. And you've only been in the country 2 years. And that was a difficult time, being actually unemployed. And then getting a job with another printing group that did a lot of annual report work down in Doornfontein, and joining them. And they had a design unit, as it was, which became a company, where when I moved in, I had 2 people there, and it was so the 3 of us were the design team. And after 2.5 years when I left, I think we were up to 20 people, because we were doing all the design and feeding the printing presses. And that was very interesting because first of all, I learned how to run a business a little bit with some good guidance, but also I met lots of people because the print reps would take me to their clients and say, come on, Jeremy will do the design, and in those days, I don't think they charged for the design. It was just put into the printing press. And then then one of my main clients, a PR group, saying, right, we think you should go off on your own. And that's when, as you say, 1st of January, and it was the 1st, not the 2nd, the 1st of January, 1973, starting as a design company, but very conscious of branding and the management of the company, and all the visual side of an organization.
So back then, what tools were you using? Was there Photoshop?
What? We had drawing boards. We had pencils and pens. We had brushes. We had inks. We had process white. People today say, what?
Exactly, I'm sure.
But that's where we started. And then we had things like Letraset and photographic prints. And I worked on a big drawing board, with a parallel motion and rapidographs, different thicknesses of pen and things like that. And I think most people today would say, well, I think a lot of your listeners and the people who follow you, they will say, well, this is another world.
Absolutely, I can't imagine. I mean, even here, I have a graphic designer, but they're all working on the computer.
Absolutely.
Everything is sort of digitized. I can't imagine ever time where you had to first, sketch on a paper, using ink.
That's right. If you wanted to deep etch a photograph, you'd have the photograph, you wouldn't have it up on screen, and you'd get a jar of special paint, and you'd have a brush, You'd have to paint around. If I have a photograph of you now and I don't want to show the background, so I'd have the photograph and then I'd have to paint out all around you. So to make sure I pick up your ear or any hair or whatever.
And now you don't pick up anything. Yeah.
And that was what it was like in those days. And then, of course, it evolved over time. Yeah. And that's where computers started coming in. But, really, I was headhunted back to England in the late 80s, and I stayed there for 5 years. We still weren't using computers. Sure. And then coming back here, when you think about it, only probably, and I'm guessing now, probably the last 20 years or so, have we used computers.
Wow. Can you use Photoshop now, or that's not your thing at all?
I'm very good at delegating.
Got you. So, let's talk about brand a bit. I think the word brand is something that is sort of thrown around a lot. You even find individuals say, I'm a brand. Maybe the first question is, like, according to Jeremy Sampson, what is a brand?
Well, I like what you've just said, because I think a lot of things are not brands, and the word brand is thrown around much too much today. A brand to me is something that you want, that you would pay for, that you'll be loyal to. A lot of people talk of, I think it was a Portuguese business school professor who said a brand is a little bit like you have a relationship with a person. So with that person, you build a relationship.
And there's emotions also involved?
Absolutely. The emotions and the practical side. After all, you buy something to give you something, whether it's a nice flavor, whether it's to transport you safely. But you want that relationship to be reliable, and you want to be proud of that relationship. And so you go on. And it's perhaps an interesting way of looking at it, because I would say to a company that, do you realize that if you have big brands, they're your major financial assets, and they guarantee you a business going forward, because people want your brand. People will go shopping. It might not be every day or every week, and if it's a car, every, 3, 4, 5 years.
Yes.
But they want to build that relationship, so you're loyal, and that means that company can look at its business projected over into the future years, how it's going to keep the business going, how it's going to be reigniting interest and not be boring, so that people actually become promiscuous and go and look at other brands.
Sure.
So it's quite a deep conversation you can have.
Yeah.
But to me, a brand is something that you want and you're proud of. Now, I'm sure there are brands that you would never use, or you'd never have a T-shirt with a big name on.
Of course.
I think all of us have brands that we have a soft spot for, whether it's a Nike. I mentioned doing some running, and my first running shoes were Pumas, and I'm going back a long way. And then I had Adidas running spikes. And today, for the most part, people will look at Nike. But then
I see you're rocking some Nikes.
And that's, to me, what a brand is about. It's something special. But I think, sometimes people still, especially non-marketing people, don't realize what a powerful part brands play in their lives. We produced a chart once where we said, well, from when you wake up during the course of your day, what brands do you use or are you aware of? And in those days, I used to write a column for the Sunday Times when they had their annual marketing supplement. And I sent this questionnaire to about 20 top marketers. And one of them, for instance, responded. He was marketing director of one of the IT companies. He said, the first thing I do in the morning is check if there's still any single malt left in my glass. Another lady said, well, I pull on my stockings, the first thing. But if you go through the day, what wakes you up? It might be your Apple, or do you still have an alarm? Then what are the brands? Is it your coffee or your tea,
Toothpaste.
breakfast, exactly.
Yeah.
And then you get in your car and go to work, or stay at home behind your computer. And you go right through the day. And how do you end your day? You know, and is it a glass of Ovaltine or whatever?
Yeah. Sure.
But actually, when you think of it like that, and how intimate it is as well.
Absolutely.
Because it's telling me a lot about you and what you do and what you enjoy.
Yeah. I mean, I always say, like, for example, even if you look at whenever I meet someone, right, and I see them wearing an Apple Watch, already I can tell what sort of their priorities are. For example, from a health perspective, they probably obviously do exercise. They are sort of conscious about, their health, and they're interested in. Also, it tells me that they're interested in improving their health just by virtue of them wearing like a device like an Apple Watch.
Yes, absolutely. Sure. No, this is where brands say a lot about people. I remember working in the past with companies, and you go out for dinner. Yeah, I was working with Airports Authority, ACSA, and we were up in Niagara Falls. No, not what am I talking about? Victoria Falls. Yes. And we were on the Zambian side, and we had a 4-day workshop up there. And then on the last night, we had dinner outside by the falls, which was incredible. Yeah, and I remember there were 2 tables of 10. There were 20 of us, and the person said, "Right, this is from ACSA, who was in charge of the whole thing." So this is our last evening together. I think we need to celebrate a very productive time. And he ordered a bottle of Blue Label.
Ooh, okay.
And sort of put it on the table with 10 glasses. And, but that gives you almost bragging rights. It said something about how he saw things that he wanted to celebrate, wanted to say thank you. Yeah. And how was he going to do it? Well, he thought a bottle of Blue Label sent the right signal.
Sure. That's and I mean, obviously, with the blue, that's a Johnny Walker, right? Johnny Walker Blue Label. It's pricey. It's upmarket. Yep. It makes a lot of sense. So I want us to touch a bit on the work of brand finance and why it matters, particularly in today's times.
Let's take a step back. As I said, was headhunted to London, worked there for 5 years, and then came back. When I came back, I was representing Interbrand, which was part of Omnicom, the big American group. Yeah. And they were doing design work and brand valuation and everything in between, as it were. And in the late 1990s. Yes. We did a brand valuation. The first one, and you might smile, was for Eskom. What? we put a value on the Eskom brand.
Interesting.
Because in those days, it was, I think, the second cheapest producer in the world, and it was revered globally as a brand. But then the next one we did was SA Breweries, and SA Breweries, so I'm doing this as Interbrand now, and we obviously had to have people coming out from London to work with us. And the team of 2 that came out from London, one of them was a guy called David Haig. And after that project, so he and I met each other, obviously, and worked together here, and he set up brand finance. So he broke away from Interbrand, and
that's his own thing.
That's 29 years ago. Yeah. But working with SA Breweries, we were working with Graham Mackay, who was the CEO. Yeah. And of course, he
was a marketer.
No, he was an engineer.
Interesting, but he's revered in the marketing.
I mentioned him because he, to me, was one of my all-time favorite CEOs. Wow. Because I think he was an engineer and a systems person. Yeah. But if someone says someone has a beautiful mind, he had a beautiful mind. It's very structured, but he certainly understood marketing. And but working with him was fantastic. And they were doing a valuation of their brands, and this was then the end of apartheid. So he knew that there was a new window opening. And remember, in those days, they couldn't spend their money outside of South Africa. So they owned OK Bazaars, retail.
Yeah, I heard they owned a lot of...
it's a conglomerate.
Yes.
And what he did was then say, right, for the future...
Even Anglo also was a big... I mean,
yes.
At some point they accounted for 80% of the JSE.
Oh, it's incredible.
Yeah.
The tentacles they had throughout industry, throughout civilization in South Africa at the time.
Sure.
But Graham then got rid of all these, basically, and got all his money together into drinks. He said, our business is drinks, alcoholic beverages, and, of course, linking with Coca-Cola, so it wasn't just alcoholic. And then finding out what value he had and developing a strategy, and McKinsey got involved. And the first brand, of course, they bought overseas was Pilsner Urquell, which was I think it was a Czechoslovakian brand. And that was the beginning of the journey. And then he moved the headquarters to London. And then, of course, they bought Miller and lots of other brands. Pilsner was the first, Peroni, and grew and grew and grew. Wow. And that was under his watch, as it were. And then he died very young, and very suddenly. I think he was only about 63 or so.
Sure.
He was still the CEO, as I recall.
Yeah.
And he died, and it was a shock to everyone.
So, I mean, you did, you worked on many brands. And one that stands out because I think it's my alma mater, UJ. But before UJ, you worked on the Springboks. I'm curious about some of the conversations that are happening, particularly on the Springbok brand. If we can start with that one, because I understand even Tebe Galafing also even tells the story, because when he was at Nike, it was really a hot topic. Some said, let's get rid of the Springbok emblem on the jersey, and it was really a contentious issue at the time.
Well, I was regarded as an Engelsman, background in England, and I built relationships, and I always try to build relationships with CEOs.
Okay.
Always with the MD or the CEO, if I could.
Not just marketers. You go.
and in, even a lot of companies today, even today, don't have someone in charge of marketing. You think you look at business to business in some areas, even today, they don't have marketers. And I had done a lot of annual report work, as I mentioned earlier, and that meant invariably there'd be a photographic session. And that meant invariably I would meet the chairman and the MD and the Exco team.
Wow.
And one of the clients had become Triumph Fertilizer, which was based in Potchefstroom, which was run by a certain Louis Late. And I did their annual report for over 10 years. And then he went to South African rugby, to Ellis Park. And immediately he called me to carry on working with him, but now on rugby issues. So we helped create the Lions brand. And we did a lot.
Pride of Johannesburg.
and I still remember, getting the original lion, of course, was a lion up on its hind legs holding a rugby ball. And then later on, we had the World Cup coming. So I was involved in the team doing all the design work. So designing around the country.
Say, the World Cup coming, that was the 97 World Cup.
95.
95, sorry, 95. 95.
Because 2 days ago is the day that the Springboks won the World Cup for the first time.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it was 2 days ago in 1995, so 30 years ago.
Yeah.
But we designed everything, the ticket and all those things. And then, of course, as you know, the row really erupted about the Springbok being an apartheid logo.
Yeah.
So Dr. Late called me in and said, we're going to have to change the Springbok.
Sure.
Otherwise, it's going to die. And we had some very...
When he said change as in change the appearance, or change sort of the behind the scenes and ultimately...
I think it started almost as loosely as we've got to do something to save it. What do we do to save it? And And I have to say, a lot of these meetings were one-on-one. Just him and me talking it through, because he had a good understanding of marketing.
Is that where you met Tebe? When you're still at Nike around it?
It was a little bit later.
Okay.
A little bit later than that. Because Tebs and I go back 20-odd years, I think. But Benang Mahali and I go back 30 years.
Sure.
You know, even I've worked with Herman Mashaba. We go back 20 years as well.
Wow.
But with Louis Late, we looked at the options, and obviously one of the things was to change the visual. But I said, how much time have we got? And he said, look, you see the papers every day. He said, we've got to do something quickly. And I said, well, if you're going to do it quickly, we haven't got many options, because if we do a complete redesign just to register it as a trademark around the world, around the rugby world, could take months. So we talked about that. But then I said, our conversation is just about it being a logo, nothing more.
Yeah.
There's more to this.
And you were to design the logo. Oh.
Well, this was the thing.
Yeah.
So out of the conversation, and it was out of the conversation, we said, right, we've got to change something with the logo, but we've got to create a brand story. So suddenly, instead of a logo discussion, it became a brand discussion. And I said, well, I'm looking at the Springbok now, and we're talking of it as an apartheid logo. How old is it? And he said, I'm not sure, but it's way, way back.
Yeah.
And he said, even South African soldiers, black and white in the Second World War, were referred to as Springboks. And I said, look, I don't know anything of this history of South Africa. So I said, where can we find out?
Yeah.
And he said, well, the previous president was Dr. Dani Craven, who was at Stellenbosch University. And he apparently, we were told, had a scrapbook. And I said, well, either I must go down or you must bring it up. He said it's priceless.
Sure.
But at any rate, 2 days later, they brought the scrapbook, and I went through it.
Sure.
And that's where I found that the first logo was in 1905.
Sure.
And then we had about 6 different logos as it evolved.
Yeah, over time.
And so I got one of my colleagues, I pulled out the 6. Louis later agreed with me. I think we had some discussion, and we said, well, that's it. And then I got someone to draw it up as artwork. And that was the first showing people how the Springbok logo had changed over the years.
Wow.
And we said, well, here's the brand story. You know, it dates back to about 1905. You know, brands go through phases. And I created a brochure showing the evolution. And then I wrote a commentary. This was for the launch of the new Springbok. And in that commentary, I gave him 2 versions.
Yeah.
I said, I don't know how aggressive you want to be. This is a very big Afrikaans. And he looked at me a bit quizzically. And in the end, in fact, he used the toned down version. Because I was saying, well, after the Second World War, would you still drive a Volkswagen? Would you wear a Hugo Boss suit? And so I started that debate going.
Sure.
And then we had to still look at the logo. Well, at that stage, the ANC had started using the King Protea as the symbol of unity. And I said, look, we have no options other than to flip the Springbok. So instead of going from right to left, make it go from left to right.
Yeah.
And we just tickled it up just a little bit, cleaned it up, and that was it. We just changed the direction it went.
Wow.
And then, of course, we put out the communications, the story, the PR, generally putting out the story that this was now the new Springbok.
And it stood for unity.
Standing for unity, but not to forget that this wasn't just thought of as an apartheid era. It went back beyond that. And how other brands went through phases where perhaps you wouldn't like them. After all, no Jewish person would drive a Volkswagen. And for a long time, the Jewish community would not drive anything German because of the Second World War. Sure. So this is where you're coming back to the emotional issues that you've talked about. And some people can be incredibly sensitive to that.
Yeah.
So that's what we did with the Springbok. You know, we actually changed the direction. And it was very interesting that the head of Sanlam at the time, Marina Starling, who's reputed to be head of the Broederbond. If your listeners know what the Broederbond was.
We often hear about it, but because when you speak to, I mean, obviously, I've read some books, but they deny that there's anything like the Broederbond in today's time.
I know.
Yeah.
But
So,
he came in for a meeting with me, and as he was walking out, he saw, as we were in a house and we had a corridor and we had logos down, and he saw the Springbok and he stopped and he said to me, "Are you the guy who made the Springbok go the wrong way?"
Yeah.
And he said it with a slight smile.
Yeah.
Because he was well known as a very strong man, shall we say. And I said, well, you could also say that I'm the guy who helped save the Springbok.
Sure.
And off he went.
Wow. I'm quite intrigued on with the examples that you made of Hugo Boss and VW, you know, in terms of, obviously there's a documented history of their association with the Nazi. But how did they manage to sort of evolve? And I mean, even to this day, they are relevant brands and they're strong brands.
And this is where, when you look at almost any brand, you know, it has a history, and you've got to track that history. And there will be phases that the brand will go through totally out of its control. But the brand, if it stays relevant, and I use that word repeatedly, will live on and keep going.
Sure.
And that's, to me, often the secret of great brands. They've gone through different iterations, and they've been challenged sometimes, but they'll keep on going. After all, Volkswagen is a fantastic brand, but it's having a difficult time at the moment because of the e-cars. And that's a different kind of challenge, but this is where the great brands, through their history, are challenged, but will find a way perhaps to stay relevant and keep going.
Yeah. Wow, that's really fascinating. So you made the Springbok go the wrong way. Or you saved the Springboks. But I remember again, the issue came up again during the Nike partnership as well.
And I wasn't involved in that side. But that's where, talking with Tebe Kalafeng, he mentions that there have been issues and rumblings from the past. And, you know, that's understandable. But that's where I often say, well, if you look at any brand that's been around for a long time, Coca-Cola now I think it's coming up to about 140 years. Look at the ANC, what is it, 110 years, whatever it is. You know, and look at the brands, the phases they've been through, the different people who've often been in control of that brand. And perhaps it wasn't called a brand originally, but today, in our parlance, it is a brand.
Indeed. Then UJ, you know, Rand Afrikaanse Universiteit, Technikon Witwatersrand.
The year 2000.
The year 2000, yes.
And we were called in to look at the whole thing.
Yeah, but I'm so sorry to interject, but I mean, this year they are 20, meaning that officially they started in 2005, officially. Yeah. But the conversation started.
It started, and I think this is where the minister, and that would be now the ANC government, and I can't remember who the minister was.
Education,
but he wanted to pull the technicons into the universities, as you've just said, you know, and this wasn't just UJ around the country. I have to say, as an aside, I think it was one of the biggest mistakes that the government ever made, because if you send someone to a technicon and they learn a trade, they have a job forever. And I think people are beginning to talk like that finally, that if they're taught to be an electrician or a plumber, because after all, everyone isn't university material.
Absolutely.
And you can sometimes get a degree and it's irrelevant today, or largely irrelevant. So, but that's as an aside. But working at UJ, and the head of the Rand Afrikaans University was Ati du Plessis, whose brother Barend du Plessis was the Minister of Finance in the government. And I worked briefly with him somewhere else when he in another position. And we were told, you know, we had to go through a process where we involved all stakeholders. So we had to do a lot of research.
I can imagine how many meetings we had.
Oh, it was the workshops, the research, the focus groups. To some people call it process absorption. You get everyone involved so that you hear their views, and then try and distill it, and distill that down to in words to what the brand should be, and then you clothe it visually, as it were, to take it forward.
Sure.
But in that process, and Ati du Plessis basically said, you've got to do it in the next, whatever it was, 3 months. And then he put one of the professors, they had a professor of mechanical engineering who became very well known, but he ran the process through. And
an engineer.
Yes, an engineer.
Not someone from the humanities faculty.
No, someone who was structured and would deliver.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that I think I only made one call to Ati during that time.
Yeah.
She said, if you need help.
Yeah.
The Afrikaans newspaper in Johannesburg, I think, was built.
Yeah, yeah.
And always on a Wednesday, they had a student section. And the head of the student union of UJ was very anti the merger. And he was putting out propaganda almost.
Hectic.
Misinformation.
Yeah.
Every Wednesday on the merger. And we had to say to Ati, look, you're going to have to close this guy down. Because he's
That's the only help you needed.
Disrupting, and and so we went. And then, we finally came to the point where we were doing the design. And we had various visuals that we put together.
Yeah.
And I wasn't happy and they weren't happy.
Yeah.
And in the end, I went to a former colleague in Cape Town,
Yes.
Sean Harrison, and Sean created the logo of the two
birds.
the two hoopoes coming together.
Yeah.
Yes. And he designed that. And
Is he still alive?
we were still managing it, but he did the actual design.
Yeah.
And I remember when we presented it at convocation, this is like 30 professors around the table. Someone said, well, you've got the birds coming together. It's an open book now, but there's no writing there. We should put some writing in. And we all held our heads and said, no, that's the last thing you do.
Yeah.
You don't want to look like an Oxford or a Cambridge or a Harvard with Latin or whatever.
Yeah.
What we're saying is your students must come to UJ and it's a blank canvas. You as a student with your learning can create what you want to fill those pages. And in the end, we won the argument, but it was hard work. That was a very difficult project. You could understand.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, like you say, you had the staunch Afrikaans, I'd say, or Afrikaners that really believed, in the Rau brand and loved the Rau brand, and then you had the technical Watersrand people as well. I mean, I can just imagine the stakeholder engagement and how do you appease everyone.
And one of the worst things is when they say, "Oh, we're going to have a competition for the logo."
Oh,
and anyone can try it.
Yeah.
Because it was quite funny after the Springbok, after flipping it around.
Yeah.
There came a point where Louis Late's PA said, "You didn't design it. We did that. We played around ourselves." They had computers already in those days.
Yeah.
And I said, "Well, then why did you get me to sign a legal document ceding copyright to you? Why would you have asked me to do that if I hadn't put it together?"
So this Louis guy was a tough guy, eh?
Oh, yeah. I have to say, in working with him a long time, I found him as a very good client in the sense that he would tell you what his thoughts were. You could go back. If he didn't like it, you could discuss it.
Yeah.
And then you could sort it out and move on. And in no time did he ever challenge an invoice from me.
Okay. That's the best part of it.
And in those days, you didn't put up cost estimates.
Yeah. You just sent an invoice.
You just sent an invoice.
And you got paid.
And I have to say his financial director, who I worked with at Triumph, and then, of course, Late took these people from his business into rugby. And there was a gentleman, Willy Kruger, who was his financial director. And I can tell you that go back 30 years, just short of a couple of weeks, I went into their offices, and Willy Kruger had a big desk, and always he'd see me and say, come and have a cup of rooibos with me. And he had on his desk an A4 document, which was the annual accounts, the financial accounts of the World Cup.
Wow.
And he very proudly said, this is the final document. And he said, for the first time ever, we've made a profit.
Wow. And 30 years later, the Springboks apparently made a loss. I'm not sure
they were almost bankrupt.
You read that, which is, the mind boggles because, I mean...
But when you think of the costs,
today.
Pat, when you think of the costs today, of flying the entourage, because it's not just 15 players, it's not, the squad is 25, 30.
Yeah.
And then you have all the backup staff and the physios and the officials. So I don't know if you're talking 40, 50 people, and you think the airfares, and they're not going to go economy, and they're big people as well, physically big.
Yeah.
So they've got to go business.
Yeah.
And then the hotels, but then all the special support, the hiring of grounds and the local physios and the diet.
And now I'm pretty sure there's even a social media team.
Well, and that's before you get to the marketing. Yeah. But it's a big business. I know the All Blacks, New Zealand, are in financial difficulties as well. And this is where it's very, very challenging today to make enough money. Now, I don't know, the Springboks had something like 35 sponsors, as I believe.
Yeah.
I think it's been reduced now down. But, you have a sponsor for, well, the shirts, sponsor for the shoes, and that's how you break it all up.
Sure. Obviously, there was a big debate, I think sometime late last year with the private equity deal. Do you think, I'm not sure if you have any opinion around this, that, sort of what one would say is a national team being owned by a private equity firm?
An American private equity firm. Look, it's a very difficult area. I know that people forget that when I was working with Louis Late, his son-in-law then was Rian Oberholzer, who today is head of Saru. It's the same Rian Oberholzer.
Sure.
So he has huge experience, huge knowledge.
Yeah.
He's a highly competent manager, but he's having to navigate through this as well. So it's a very challenging area. But when you think now that if they fly off to Australia, New Zealand in one direction, they fly to Argentina, another one, up into Europe, you think of those costs. It's a bit scary.
It is indeed. Then you also, you worked on a brand that I think you'll find in every South African household. Sunlight. Some of it, I mean, we use it for different, purposes. It has become that, I'd say, mainstay brand in South Africa. As we were chatting offline, you also told me a story of how you spent half a day trying to describe what fresh looks like, or sounds like, or smells like even.
Well, Unilever, which owns Sunlight, has its brand key methodology. This is where many companies and consultancies have their own models, if I can call them that they use to define a brand. And Unilever have this brand key system, which incidentally they used to define brand South Africa back, 30 years or so ago, where Niall Fitzgerald, who was the head of Unilever in South Africa, basically donated some expertise from Unilever to help South Africa define its country brand.
I see.
So that's where that...
Tell me more. I'm very curious.
And Niall Fitzgerald then after, like a lot of big multinational groups, bright young people coming up, they'll send them for 2 or 3 years somewhere else to pick up at a different perspective and then bring them back to head office. And Niall Fitzgerald went back to London and became eventually the CEO of Lever Brothers. But, and Unilever was Dutch English as well. It wasn't just English.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that Sunlight, as you say, was the green bar. But already they were realizing that they could move into washing powder. And is it hand washing or machine washing or dishwashing or whatever? And for some reason, and I don't know how it came about, they had different ad agencies handling the different industry sectors.
Yeah.
And I presume they had one person down in Durban, which is where they were based, was the overall marketing director.
Yeah.
And I think it might have been a lady called Angela Brocker, who you worked with. But then they'd have had sub-marketing directors for those segments. And we had a call from a guy I knew who was the executive creative director of J. Walter Thompson in Johannesburg.
Yeah.
And he said, look, can we have a beer together? And no, we had a beer. Yeah. And he said, look, this is crazy. We've got different agencies doing their own things, but it's still
one brand.
He said, am I right? And I said, well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And long story short, what happened was then we were approached and we were appointed to help define, working very closely with Unilever, the Sunlight brand. So that definition, the DNA of the brand, would be given to all the agencies at that stage. They still wanted to keep different agencies, but they had to then follow the Sunlight brand storybook, as it were. And as you mentioned, we got one of the key things was freshness, and people couldn't agree. I remember we had our offices in Johannesburg. Yeah. There must have been, I don't know, I think all three agencies were in the room. Yeah. That probably added to the debate. But then we couldn't agree. And in the end, Angela turned around and said, well, okay, we've discussed all these things. We've ticked a lot of boxes, but we're stuck on this one thing. We'll have another workshop next week where we'll just discuss. So she said, I want you all to go away and you come back and tell me what you think is fresh or what is not fresh. And out of that, we will define the whole thing, which is what we did. And then once that was set in stone, as it were, then we moved on to the design. We freshened up the design of the Sunlight brand and then started applying it across the board in a consistent way, especially, of course, on packaging.
Wow.
So it was a fascinating project. And the professionalism of Lever Brothers was incredible. And again, learning to work within a multinational in their own way. Because, whether it's Coca-Cola or Procter & Gamble, Lever Brothers, they all have their own models and their own ways of doing things.
Yeah. So what I'm really interested about Unilever, I mean, you mentioned Unilever, is that, I mean, some of the top marketers today, especially the CMOs and marketing execs, actually started somehow their careers or one or the other. They worked at Unilever, and they've become the best. So Unilever and SAB, I think what is special about those particular institutions, if I were to call them? What is it that they did, that really stood out, and made anyone who worked within those organizations become great marketers?
I think within Lever Brothers, Unilever, the whole culture is marketing driven. So whoever you were, to get to the top, you had to have a huge knowledge of marketing. And Niall Fitzgerald, as I say, became an institution. He wrote papers on marketing, and he gave speeches where he could explain marketing in layman's terms. SAB, you're quite right. A lot of people thought SAB was the place to go to as well. Yeah. But if I mentioned earlier doing the valuation for SAB's brands, and that was quite an education because we were working with beer division as it was. I had created the SAB beer division identity about 10 years earlier, which was the beer mug. You may remember the beer mug, SAB letters underneath, and we had created that in my company. Yeah. And when we got to the final presentation of the brand value of SAB, suddenly into the room came the marketers and in came the financial people. And they didn't know each other. We actually were introducing them to each other. And I've never forgotten that because there seemed to be almost a divide between finance and marketing. Yeah. So even though SAB in those days was a good place to go to learn marketing, they still thought of the things as separate. And, we haven't touched on it yet, but, in some organizations, marketing and finance have a difficult relationship, shall we
Yes,
say?
actually, interestingly, during my sorry to interject there, during my speech, at the fourth annual Yobas, I did sort of challenge marketers to build a better relationship with finance, because some of the obviously compliance sort of issues from a finance point of view do sort of impede the progress that marketing intends to make, because some projects require upfront payments, but finance wants you to fill in forms upon forms upon forms. And by the time you're done with the process, even some of the companies today, as small as we are, as a business, the process takes about 3 to 6 months just to get loaded as a supplier before you even get a brief.
Well, this is where within brand finance, our tagline, if I can call it that, is bridging the gap between marketing and finance, because that still applies.
Yeah.
And this is where it's a challenge in some organizations. We were talking offline about a conference a few weeks ago where some of the speakers were saying that within their organization, there was no understanding of what marketing did other than spend money, and also the importance of brands.
Yeah.
And that is an ongoing challenge where sometimes the culture is like this. I know that at SAB at the time, there was a marketing director who, again, I worked with, and I was reading, I think I used to read Fortune magazine, and there was an interesting article on Procter & Gamble, where the CEO was Mr. A.J. Luffley, who became famous.
Yeah.
But he made an interesting point at Procter & Gamble. He'd say most organizations have a corporate strategy, and then other strategies evolve from it, and you get brand and communications. At Procter & Gamble, he put brand strategy first and this corporate strategy second.
Sure.
And I was speaking at a conference in Durban, and I was speaking at the start of the second day, and the current MD of SAB Beer Division spoke on the first day.
Yeah.
And he came up to me, and I knew him quite well. He came up to me at the start. He said, "Jeremy, I pinched one of your slides just to let you know. I've given you credit for it."
Yeah.
He said, "I showed that slide where you said brand strategy first, and then out of that flowing corporate strategy." And, that's an interesting debate as well when you actually look at what goes on, what drives a lot of businesses. It's not just FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods.
Yeah.
In a lot of other areas, the brand, and also we haven't used the word reputation now, but reputational issues come into play.
Sure. Obviously, I guess now this is where the works of brand finance really, become relevant in terms of, obviously, you guys evaluate or value brands. You attach a monetary value to your brand. Do you think most companies understand that?
I think in Europe and the States, the answer largely is yes. And in Asia. Asia is going up at a rate of knots. I think here it's still pretty hard work, but when a Tiger Brands buys a brand like they bought a chutney brand, and they had to pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah.
And this is where sometimes within your portfolio, you want to add things or take things or sell things, because in the States especially, a lot of companies are buying and selling brands. They are assets. Like Gatorade, the energy drink, has been bought and sold, 5 times in the last 20 years. And, where Coca-Cola has something like, and again, don't quote me, but about 200 different brands. But some of those brands are water brands. Now, I was working for KWV in Paarl with their wine brands, their brandy brands, and they wanted to rejig the whole marketing department. So I was involved as an external overview, as it were, choosing the people who would join them.
Yeah.
But, then they came to the time when the managing director said, "I'm thinking of getting a new area, a new brand. What would you think of?" Now, I'm talking 10, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And I said, "How about water?"
Sure.
And again, he looked at me very, very old-fashioned. But, you think back 10, 12 years ago, how many water brands there were around. Whereas today, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere.
Is it Thirsty or this or that?
Yeah,
What's the hottest water brand at the moment?
Yeah.
And this is where sometimes if you're in the drinks business, you have to have a full range, a full bouquet. You might not feel like a beer or a glass of wine, but you'd like a water or a Coke or an energy drink. And, as SAP used to say, we want share of throat.
Yeah, yes.
We want share of throat. We don't care what you drink of ours, as long as it's ours.
Sure. Did KWV launch a water brand?
No. No, they didn't.
So
they've gone into other areas. They've got a creamy liqueur. I think they've gone into gin, but they stayed in the alcoholic drinks area, and that's what they've focused on, and derivatives of wine and brandy as well. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I mean, I think 2 weeks ago, you published a list of most valuable brands in Africa, and South Africa obviously is leading the charge. So the world of brand in Africa, broadly then obviously coming down to South Africa, are Africans taking branding seriously or building brands? Or it's a nice to have?
That's a good question. Brand finance focused to start with on the financial value of a brand. And there's an international standards, 10667 or something like that. And that was where it started. And then out of the financial value of a brand, and both Interbrand and Brand Finance sometimes were approached by companies who wanted to buy and sell brands. It was as simple as that.
Yeah.
And also sometimes when you actually look at a company's shares that own brands, the value of the brands was not reflected in their share price. So there was that interaction. Then it started looking more at brand strength. And brand strength is almost the non-financial side of a brand. What is its reputation? How does it compare against its peers? Is it investing in its brand? And now that has stretched out over the last 28 years or so, that, for instance, companies are saying, well, we own this property in sponsorship. Is it giving us our ROI, our return on investment? So this is where brand finance, most of the strength is with the accountants, the financial guys, but then there are people like me within the world who can talk the branding side, the marketing side, and we work as a team.
Yeah, when you say, okay, we value a brand, and I mean, MTN, for example, if you say MTN is worth 50 billion rands as a brand, what do we look at? You mentioned sponsorship, for example, maybe how they own a particular property.
That's where the brand value, as I say, is an international standard. But the brand strength, some people would call it the brand equity, is another ISO. So this is where you have on the brand strength a checklist of about 10 points. Sorry, not 10 points, 100 points, which you can go through and measure.
What are some of those?
Well, what are the perceptions of the brand? Is it? Let's look at Checkers at the moment. Checkers in that Africa 200 is the strongest brand in Africa. Wow. It beats everything. It beats the banks and everything. And Checkers has come up to being the strongest.
And Checkers or ShopRite?
Well, that's a good point. But Checkers is the one. And ShopRite is seen as a separate brand with a value on it as well.
This Checkers example is very fascinating and interesting to me, because if you look at Checkers compared to ShopRite, Checkers is more premium and it's sort of more available in urban areas. Whereas with ShopRite, for example, you can find in deep rural areas, in townships, and in even cities. Like, there's a ShopRite in downtown Johannesburg, but there isn't the Checkers.
And that's where how you position your brand physically sometimes. What areas is it in? And of course, Checkers has, now I was mentioning that earlier today, I had a journalist from one of the top newspapers writing an article on Checkers and asking me how come they are the strongest brand in Africa, and how come they rate so highly globally on brand strength. Because financially they don't rate at all, of course. All African brands are much too small financially. Even MTN doesn't rate financially. They're minnows compared with the top brands in the world, like the Apples and the Amazons and people like that. But on brand strength, often when you have a smaller footprint, as it were, so South Africa, even Southern Africa, your brand strength can be very strong. So when it comes, for instance, to banks, Capitec and FNB especially have huge brand strength scores. And we find also in Kenya, Equity Bank and KCB have got very strong scores on brand strength. But this is where you have to dig into the data. And as I say, we have number crunchers who will go through the whole thing and put it all together. And we're producing, I don't know, over 100 rankings a year. So not just South Africa, but individual countries, by sector, banks, insurance, oil and gas, whatever. We've now, the last 2 years, started moving more and more into sustainability and nation branding. And then there's the soft branding area as well, which, especially with the world as it is, with the Ukraine war and Gaza, etc., suddenly it's not just soft, it's hard as well. And so this all relates back to brands.
I mean, you talked about sustainability, particularly in the last, 2 to 3 years. But 2 years ago, we didn't have Trump in the White House. And as soon as he walked in, he started denouncing, some of the sustainability efforts that were being made. And all of a sudden, you don't hear a lot being said around the ESG goals and anything along those lines.
It's very interesting because I think most people would agree that sustainability aspects are very important, but not a blanket ticking the boxes. But as we stand today, when people talk about carbon neutral, and I'm not sure they understand what it means, and I certainly am not quite sure. But then when companies like British Petroleum, BP in the UK, and here Sasol, have people standing up at their AGMs saying you've got to reduce this and you've got to reduce that, and therefore you've got to change the way you do things. And everyone says, yes, we must. But then later on they come back and say, well, we want to, but do you realize it's going to cost us X billion to change this and change that and change the way we do things? And in some cases, you can't afford to do it. And this is where BP backtracked a year ago and said, we can't do it. We'd like to, but we can't. And now you've had Sasol do the same in this country. So it's difficult, the jockeying that's going on. And this is where sometimes you have the politicians or the powers that be setting down regulatory hurdles or timelines, which the people concerned might say yes to begin with. But as they get into it more and more, they say, no, hang on, we've got a problem here.
Interesting. Before I let you go, I can't help but ask you about, the role of a modern day CMO. We obviously, I find it interesting that there's still sort of some debates, going on around the role of a CMO and why they're not invited in the boardroom, and the perception that there's still a party / color room. There's lots of perceptions just around marketing. And in your view, if there's a CMO watching right now and you can give them some sort of piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, you and I talked off air at the beginning about this is business. This is serious business. When you talk of MTN as a brand worth 50 billion, not million, billion, that's serious business. And this is where I often think, to be honest, that marketers do a terrible job of marketing what they can do and what they can achieve and what they're in charge of. A lot of your listeners will be too young to remember the Marketing Journal, which was edited by Jeremy Maggs.
Oh, yes. The legendary. Jerry, another legend that I need to bring here.
But I wrote an article, Has Marketing Got a Marketing Problem?
Let me tell you a story. I'm so sorry to do this to you. Actually, Jeremy Maggs, Maggs on Media, inspired me to start Pattern Brands. So when back in 2014, 2013, right about that time, when he still had the show on E, I used to watch it so religiously. Then that inspired me to start a blog, and I called the blog Pattern Brands. I just thought I should share that. So he's had an impact on my career.
I think he's had an impact on the whole marketing industry. You know, when I came back from London, I was again headhunted back in 1992. It was that long ago, and was already then representing Interbrand, and then 10 years ago moving to brand finance. But Jeremy Maggs used to have his Sunday morning on SABC, and I think for 5 years he ran that show, and it ran from 9 in the morning until 11 in the 2 hours.
Oh, 2 hours.
2 hours,
on marketing.
Yeah.
Wow.
Marketing and advertising.
Yeah.
He always would have the last person in the studio asking for a piece of music. And I was the last person in that studio for his last show.
Wow.
And on the show, he said, and I always used to drive in to SABC because and I've always thought face-to-face is so important. And he said, why do you think you're here as the last one? I said, I have no idea. And he said, well, in 5 years, you've been here 57 times. You have been here more than anyone else. So you were going to help me close off the show.
Wow.
And but, you know, this is where we need ambassadors for marketing, which is what you're doing now, which is fantastic. But
thank you, Talang. We're doing something great here.
But this is so important. We've got to, you know, even talking today to some marketers, they say, we need to get you back into our boardroom. And I said, well, I gave that lecture, for instance, at Sasol back in about 2002. That's over 20 years ago. And they said, well, we need it again. And this is where I feel that, you know, someone said, what's one of the advantages of old age? And I said, well, hang on. But as you get older, sometimes, who cares if you're fired? You can be blunt. And this is where perhaps
you have an advantage.
Whether it's advisory or sounding board or helping or giving experience. If you don't like it, that's fine. You want to fire me? That's fine. But you've asked me for my honest view. I'm not giving you any angles. I'm giving you straight from the shoulder. Why don't you try this? Or why don't you do this? Or I think you're mistaken. There's a gentleman who died last Saturday, Dick Foxton, and you might have come across him. He was one of the doyens of the PR industry. He only had clients who were CEOs. He didn't work for the company. He worked for the person.
Wow.
And so whether it was Eskom or ArcelorMittal, a lot of those people, he was very, very experienced. And he has his funeral later this week. And, you know, there'll be a lot of people there, like, for instance, former president of South Africa will be there, I'm sure. Like Thabo Mbeki's brother, who comments a lot about, he will be there. And this is where Dick Foxton, you know, he would say it as he saw it. And he said, if people don't like it, that's it. He said, so many people pussyfoot around the chief executive. And I think that's one of the reasons I've built relationships with CEOs where I give them my honest advice as best I can. And they know that. They haven't got people who, like Donald Trump, for instance, perhaps has around him, always saying, yes, sir, great idea, sir.
Daddy.
Let's do it.
They call him Daddy now.
It's a beautiful idea.
I interjected you, and obviously this is a very fascinating conversation. You wanted to share something that Jeremy Maggs used to write on the marketing channel with respect to the role of a CMO and business.
He understood, and after all, he he's right. No one else has been writing about this. Have you ever seen anything? You know, there's no magazine today. Well, perhaps people say, well, hang on, podcasts. So Pat needs to talk about it more. Or Mags has no conduit anymore. You know, he's running a business program. So, and this is where I often say, I started putting things out into the press because I felt there was a vacuum. You know, when I go way, way back, I was elected president of South African designers. I became president at about the age of 34 or so.
Sure.
And I started putting out...
my age.
And I started putting out stories on design.
Sure.
And design related to business. And how if you didn't look good, people wouldn't buy you. You know, and you know the power of the visual.
Yeah.
So these are all things, and Jeremy Maggs and others over the years have played that role. But, you know, he used to have a column in Financial Mail, and that's been stopped. Often people think of what we're talking about is advertising, and it's so much more. You know, gone before you was Tony Kunderman, who used to write in Finance Week, and he used to talk about advertising and marketing. And I said, Tony, you're wrong. It's marketing
and advertising.
And he wouldn't listen.
Yeah.
And I said, this is where, come on, things change.
Yeah.
You've got to stay relevant. Marketing is the umbrella now.
Yeah.
Whether you're doing digital, this or that, whether you've got podcasts, this or that, that's the overarching. And, you know, everyone has to be focused and coordinated on that brand, whatever it is.
Sure. I see we're running out of time. Already we're an hour, 15 minutes in.
Whoa.
And he said you only speak for 15 minutes. I appreciate you being so generous with your time. Before we close, I can't help but ask, you know, a question, you know, that speaks to what the young ones who are watching this episode right now, and they trying to find, you know, their feet in the industry. And obviously there's also an element of sort of being impatient a bit, because with social media now they overexposed, and obviously they think they know everything as well. So you're dealing with a different kind of a young person. And if there's any advice, especially marketing related, that you could share if they want to make it in this industry, what would it be?
That's a great question, because I was on the advisory of Vega for quite a long time. And I remember there was one time when we were able to give scholarships, and we had 2 scholarships, 2 young ladies, and we were just paying their school fees. And then it was only later I realized, well, that's only half the story.
Sure.
How are they going to live? How are they going to eat? How are they going to travel in and out of varsity? So it's a tough road, but to me, marketing is one of the most exciting things. One of the most exciting things around. But you've got to stay relevant. And, you know, you've mentioned AI.
Yeah.
When were you first conscious of the term AI? You know, in my case, it's probably less than 2 years, 3 years.
I was fortunate, as I was telling you offline, that I did my master's research on big data. It was during that time when the 4th industrial revolution was sort of being hyped up. So AI was, you know, a subset, but it wasn't really as popular as it is now.
And now it's absolutely flying. But to any marketer, you know, you've got the theoretical from university or whatever. You've got to get the practical. And that means you've got to get your foot on the rung, as you know, and that's often the most difficult thing, to get a job to start with.
Sure.
But once you get a job, then you've now got the practical side of things. Now, I was a visiting professor at a graduate school of business at UCT. And I used to go in for only a day a year, but I was introduced to someone who would tell war stories. So in other words, they were doing the theoretical of the EMBA, but I would tell them the war stories of real life things. So any student has to get into the real life because the opportunities are huge. I think you need to choose what sector you want to be in, because again, the choices can be incredible. But the opportunities, but then you've got to read and read and read to learn about what's going on. watching your podcasts, watching the people the legends, the icons, the people that come through this studio with you. You've got to learn all those things. And often if you reach out to people, these people, they can help you or give you some advice or guide you. But I've always said as well, if you can make your career your hobby, I've always thought that making
that's an interesting
your hobby
concept,
and your hobby your career, not everyone agrees with that. I think, in fact, it was Steve Jobs of Apple once gave a lecture at one of the top universities like Stanford, and he said something similar. Whatever gets you engaged, if you can make that your job as well, you won't worry about 9 to 5. You're living it, you're doing it, and that way you're going to be better than the person who is 9 to 5. Because again, all of us as personal brands have competition from everyone else out there.
Absolutely.
So when you graduate, when you finish from university, or you might not even go to university now, you can take fantastic courses through Google or whatever, which you can do from home, and they might be a lot cheaper if they cost any money at all. So you've got to keep learning and doing things. But I know that there's such a dearth of talent. So many people have got the academic side, but they lack the experience. And then, of course, if you can, travel.
Okay.
At SFW, Stellenbosch Farmers Group, which became Distel, and we created that name Distel. The head of marketing there, who we were dealing with about 5 years ago, is an Indian lady who was heading up all of the marketing of SFW. And then SFW did their deal with Diageo. And so the project we were hoping to do, and I'd worked with them a lot, fell away because Diageo didn't want it. But she was one of the first people they took from Stellenbosch. They took her to Holland, and now she's winning all sorts of awards. At Cannes last week, her team won lots of awards for what she's doing. And this is where I think you sometimes, and you might want to interview her on this program.
What's her name?
I'll have to look it up. But we dealt with her, we worked with her, then she was taken over. And if you go onto LinkedIn, there are pictures of her and her team at Cannes in France last week, winning major awards and getting that international experience. So again, whether you go to a Unilever, whether you go to an SAB, perhaps if you go to an international group, it'll give you an opportunity to travel and to move around. But sometimes you've got to start perhaps on the unsexy side of things. I use that carefully. Some business to business, doing some PR, but get your foot in the door. Once you get that foot in the door, then it hopefully will take you forward.
Or even do promotions. Because I started
anything. Absolutely.
I started doing in-store promotions, and at some point I also handed out. My first time in Bryanston, let me tell you a story. I was handing out flyers at that big intersection of William, when it was still William Nicole, and the N1, that big intersection. I was handing out flyers.
I don't remember my one daughter was handing out shooters at some exhibition. When I heard that, I said, "Who's the brand?" So I wasn't very happy, but you're absolutely right. You need that experience. In life, you've got to have different experiences. When I was studying at art school, during our summer months, we used to earn money to carry us through to supplement our grant. And for 3 years, I was a bus conductor. In the days that you had bus conductors. So it wasn't just the driver. You had your machine and you doled out. But I tell you, the one side effect of that was your mental arithmetic becomes very good. Because you're taking the money and you're issuing the tickets. But you're dealing with real people. Now, this is one of the challenges today is people aren't getting out. Youngsters need to get out. They can't sit behind their computer all the time. They can't sit at home all the time. They've got to get out and mingle and interact and see what's happening out there. Because one of the best examples, sorry, I'm rattling on now.
No.
But Checkers coming out with their scooter delivery, the 60. That is brilliant. And, it came out of COVID, but now they were first mover. Now they've developed it. Where I live down near the Bluebird Centre, when you drive into the parking lot, you have to be careful. All the scooters are shooting out. And going up and down on the lift, all the scooter guys are there. And I talk to them. I say, what's happening with business? What are people buying? What's going on? And doing research all the time as well. So you understand what's going on.
Sure.
So all these things are important to build that knowledge.
Wow. On that note, Mr. Sampson, I want to thank you for making the time and really joining us in this conversation. There's a lot to talk about. I feel like we need a second round, you know? I'm really fascinated by what you just shared right now. And I can really, you know, for me, this was like a history / marketing / branding, you know, masterclass. And I hope even all our viewers do feel like that and do, you know, take some of the lessons that you shared with us. Lastly, if there's anyone that wants to connect with you, what is the best way to reach out to you?
I guess email is best, and that is j.sampson, SAMPSON, @brandfinance.com. And that's how you can get me.
Awesome stuff. Thank you once again. And for those that are watching this channel for the first time, please don't forget to click the subscribe button. That's the only way we will grow. And for me, Pat Mahlangu ngithi inakhailale.
Pat. It's Pat on Brands. Watch how you brand it, man. A pat on the back is a pat from the man. Better be branded, man. A pat from the pat is a pat on the brand. If it's enormous.